Hello there. So this is a pre-recording of a PowerPoint. So for those of you that like to hear an active lecture, would be a good way for you to hear about what we're learning about this week. And this week we're learning about the New World. And in particular, we're focusing on pre and post contact in the Americas. Okay, so really historians have stopped saying America's story begins in 1492, when Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue. You probably heard that in elementary or even maybe in some of your secondary classes before. But historians really want to focus on what the societies were like before Columbus arrived. So they were extremely advanced societies that had quite a bit to offer, and they were quite advanced. Okay, so 1491, like I said, and there's a great book called 1491, and it focuses entirely on this. But essentially, historians really kind of disagree on the origin of Native Americans in America. A lot of them said, you've probably heard before that there was a land bridge that took people here like 12,000 years ago. Well, now there's some historians that saying, and anthropologists too, we don't want to not include them in the story, but they're actually saying that there were many more people that came here even earlier than that, or there were people that already existed like tens of thousands of years prior to that. So there's just debate on exactly how long they were. But one thing for sure, they were here, and many of them were extremely advanced societies. Many were primitive in many ways, but many had very, very distinct, complex attributes. Okay. The other thing is they weren't one type of people. They were a ton of different people with many different dialects, many different types of religions. And so, we tend to group them into one category, calling them Indians or, classifying them in that sense. And that's just wrong on a lot of different levels. Okay, so one thing that for sure that a lot of the society had in common and what was spread, diffused as tribes, and I really should be saying nations, tend to connect and make connections as they began to trade maize, which is corn. So maize was essentially the center of culture prior to contact. Before maize was introduced in society and began to be cultivated into these societies, they were very nomadic and they moved around from place to place. But as soon as they start to cultivate this, many of those nations, those Indian nations, really centered their entire religions, and they centered their entire homes and their villages, and they started to remain more sedentary. They also started to develop very complex and advanced irrigation systems. This really kind of transforms the society. They live longer, their populations increase, and so this was a very essential part of their society. Now, if we look into the Americas, you can see this map, and this map has quite a few different types of regional groups that were in these areas, and this is the way that people tend to group them. In the Northwest, hunting, foraging, Great Plains and Great Basin areas, lots of different hunting. It was a little more arid, harder to really have agriculture in the area. And in the Northeast, it was a mixture of agriculture and hunting. Okay, one thing for sure, though, the Native Americans, they used things for their homes, and their societies really depended on the geography and the climate of what was around them. So to go into a little bit more detail, the Northwest and present-day California area, about 300,000 Native American tribes and nations lived in that area before Europeans made any kind of contact. One of the more advanced societies is a group called the Chinooks. They were extremely advanced warrior society. They also had very advanced fishing techniques. This is an example of them using the resources, around them like other groups did, and then salmon fishing in this area. Okay, another group in that area, kind of like in the present Washington, Oregon state area, was the Shoshone. And they had this pretty distinct, very, complex fishing system called a fishing weir. And this is, you can see this drawing, this was from a European. Once they did have contacts, they were just fascinated at the fact that they had this fishing weir. And so they took this back and they actually implemented that into their own fishing methods. So that should tell you, you know, how advanced some of these societies were. Okay, so the Great Plains and the Great Basin Indians, as we know, their lives centered really around the bison. They're, you know, you probably remember this from your 7th grade history too, but essentially, you know, their homes were made of bison hide. They use the teeth and the bones for weapons and for utensils and things like that. And so their entire existence really centered around the bison. So they were generally very nomadic because they followed the herd around. Okay, and that's in the kind of central part of the United States, modern day United States. So in the Northeast and the Atlantic seaboard, these many different types of societies and Indian nations there too. One of the most famous ones was the Iroquois. They had probably one of the most advanced governmental systems for Native American nations during that time. It was very much a matriarchal society. And so women were actually pretty much a high center, big part of the community there. And they were big decision makers. Now, I will tell you, too, that because women were at the center of this, you know, Europeans was very patriarchal. Okay, and they had patrilineal, where Iroquois had matrilineal societies. And they saw the fact that women had so much power. They saw that, or viewed that, as very barbaric, which of course, you know, we know that that's not true, right, ladies? All right. Anyway, so just like I talked about a moment ago, women had much more greater autonomy, and I'm going to be using that word quite a bit. Autonomy meaning, you know, self control or self rule. Really, that's what it means. But because women were such a central part of Indian society, again, Europeans found this to be extremely barbaric and saw it as a way that they needed to be Christianized and westernized, you know, by this. Okay, so now we get to Columbus's voyage in 1492. I hope you watch the video clip, if you haven't already, on Columbus's voyage, because this will kind of squash a lot of viewpoints that I think that you probably were taught, maybe many of you may already have a lot of knowledge into what really happened with Columbus's voyage, and of course the debate that goes on. And that's actually a discussion question for this week, is on Columbus's voyage. But he lands in the Bahamas in 1492. He brings inhabitants back to Spain, and you know, and he does get himself involved in the slavery, you know, the enforced slavery, especially of young girls, and brings them back and forth, especially the Portuguese. The Portuguese were really hook, line, and sinker into Indian slaves. But the interesting part is Columbus makes continuous voyages back and forth, really believing that he landed in India. This is, of course, why they called them Indians, because he believed they landed in India. And he actually makes a total of 4 journeys there, and he dies thinking that he had discovered a new route to India, which of course we know is not true. So I encourage you to watch that video clip. I think it's really good. I think you should watch that. Okay, so obviously some technological improvements helped this along: the sextant, the caravel, the compass, and something called joint stock companies, which we'll visit next week when we start talking about the colonial regions. Because the British colonial regions, this was actually founded by the Dutch, the joint stock companies, this idea that instead of getting funding from the crown and, you know, from a king or queen, you would actually have individual merchants and people that had money pool money together and fund a voyage. And so this is how Jamestown was founded, with the Virginia Company, and also actually how the Pilgrims came through the Mayflower was from a Dutch joint stock company. So we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Okay, this is a little bit misplaced here. Okay, the other purpose of exploration was from something called the 3 Gs. And you guys heard this, you know, God, gold, and glory, and everybody has the different historical opinion on which one of those was more important to which society. But one thing that definitely happens when Europeans do start making contact, of course, is the Columbian Exchange. And hopefully you've heard this, and this is just a refresher, but essentially the Columbian Exchange was just the exchange of goods to and from the Americas, which is the New World, to the Old World, which was Europe. Okay? And so you can see from this image all the different types of goods and ideas that were exchanged. There were plenty of positives and negatives in both, okay? Obviously, there was a lot of negatives when it came to disease in the Americas themselves, smallpox, things like that. But in some aspects, like the fact that guns and horses were brought over, really actually helps in the Plains Indians and nations that, focus primarily on hunting. It makes them faster and more efficient. Of course, later on, that's going to present a huge issue for Europeans in contact because the Indians will use that to fight against them too. Okay, but in the old world, they had an enormous benefit: population growth, corn and potatoes. They moved from like a feudalistic society and they moved to more of a capitalist society, especially with joint stock companies. And in particular, interestingly, with their population growth, they used to be on like a wheat-based diet, but of course, when the Americas and corn, they had a corn-based diet, and it was, essentially a lot healthier for them. This is a map that really shows the Spanish-American world. And of course, interesting, Hernan Cortez. And there's quite a bit of history behind Hernan Cortez. I will probably put another video clip on it with him. There's a show called Mankind by the History Channel that has a really good 6-minute clip on Hernan Cortez. And now that I'm thinking about it, I probably should put that on there for you too. But essentially, he lands off the coast in Mexico, and he becomes allies with some of the Indian nations that had recently been taken over by the Aztecs, which they didn't call themselves an Aztec, side note. But Montezuma and his group, they pretty much had controlled and took over that area. He goes to the modern-day city, the Aztec capital, and essentially kills Montezuma, takes him hostage, and takes over, essentially. So he, essentially took over that very powerful city, which is the modern-day city of Mexico City. So that really puts a foothold of colonization that really begins post-Cortez for the Spanish into Mexico, modern-day Mexico in the Latin American area. One of the systems that the Spanish integrate into Mexico is a system called the encomienda system. So essentially what this was that the Spanish crown gave land grants to, it was a lot of conquistadors, but, nobility and people that wanted to settle in the world. And the idea was that you would be given a land grant, and the idea was you would Christianize the natives. Don't forget the 3 G's, right? And the Spanish got tribute from the Indians, saying that it had to be, crops and things like that. But essentially what it turns into is a form of enslavement for the Indians. And it becomes extremely an abusive system. And if they're not working the farms, they're working the mines and doing things like that. Eventually, this system will be replaced with African slavery in Spain. And then eventually, the Spanish will be one of the first to actually outlaw slavery altogether. But at the beginning, encomienda system definitely is what begins, okay? So interestingly, though, the Indians, there was debate over the treatment of Indians. Bartolomé de las Casas and Sepulveda were people that were like split over the debate over it. And de las Casas, essentially, he was a friar. And at first he was okay with the encomienda system. He didn't really know much about it. But when he comes over and he lives here for about 4 years, he realizes that the indigenous peoples are a very good group of people. And he felt that they were rational and there was no reason to enslave them, and it was actually wrong. And so he writes a series of letters back and forth to the crown and back and forth to the people of Spain, pleading the case on why the encomienda system should really end. Sepulveda, on the other hand, was a believer in white superiority. He said that we are saving the Indians through this thing called Christian liberty. So, they're being saved that way. And so Sepulveda loses the debate. De las Casas wins, and they get rid of the encomienda system. They do replace it with a system called repartimento system, which, was a little better, but still somewhat abusive. But, they didn't essentially enslave them. And as much as you probably want to champion and say, yay, De las Casas, he's our man, he's so great, he didn't have any trouble with African slavery. So maybe he didn't live with Africans and see the same equality that he saw with Indians, but either way, it is what it is. So at the beginning of colonization, the Spanish actually forbade any kind of intermarriage between Indians and the Spanish. But they pretty soon get rid of that idea when they realize that the best way to Christianize the Indians was to have intermarriage. This was something, by the way, that the French and the Dutch had discovered long before. And they automatically said the way that we really, are going to trade and gain financially and colonize well is if we allow and encourage intermarriage. But the Spanish, they created a system called the casta system or the caste system, and they actually commissioned artists who paint, what this different caste system would be. So you can see this painting that's here on this image. This is a casta painting, which, by the way, is still in Mexico City today. Mexico City's got the largest historical archives in the world, because they've got the Spanish Inquisition records there, and they also have the casta paintings and all kinds of things related to colonization. But you can see that the highest people in the caste system were the pure Spanish, and it goes all the way down. The term mulattoes, you may not realize that was termed from the Spanish caste system. And, they would get super complicated, like all kinds of mixes, and they would essentially rank them. You can see the numbers that are on there, okay, if you look here carefully, that they're actually ranking like how high they were in the hierarchy. So the Spanish were, I wouldn't say utter failures, but really they had a very difficult time converting the Native Americans at first. They established a mission system with presidios that had military bases to try to protect, their colonies too. But the natives really wanted to preserve their autonomy. They didn't want to be converted. And what a lot of them did in that meantime was they would implement elements of Catholicism elements of their religion into Catholicism. And so, there were conflicts here and there where they kind of forced to do that. One interesting case was a guy named Juan Oñate, and this is also known as the Ocoee Massacre in New Mexico. And essentially what happened was that there was a skirmish between the Ocoee Pueblo in northern New Mexico, and Oñate's tribe, soldiers. And one of those soldiers was his nephew, and in the skirmish, his nephew was killed. And so in retaliation for killing his nephew, he sends 500 men and kills 500 men and 300 women and children, brings them to their death. And then the men that survived, he lined them up, and I'm not joking, every male over the age of 18, their right foot was cut off. That's not an exaggeration. That's a real story. Okay, well, I guess over the age of 25. So, kind of a funny story, not really funny story, I'm sorry, it's not funny. But in 1988, a group of Ocoee Pueblos, they had a statue of Oñate at this national park. And on the 400th anniversary of the Ocoee Massacre, they cut off his foot of Oñate statue in New Mexico. And this is what, this quote here is what a tribal member had to say about that. When I think of what Oñate did to the Ocoee Pueblo, I have a vision of Indian men lined up to have one foot cut off. I see the blood pouring from their legs as they crawled or hopped away. I see the bloody pile of feet left behind. Now, interestingly enough, that this issue has come up with the statues being taken down recently. And I will say that one of the statues that was taken down, a few of the statues, was the Iñate statue. And frankly, knowing the story, I can understand why that would be an issue for them. But anyway, that is it. That's all I've got to present for you. I hope it helped to learn it a little more. If you've got feedback or something like that you'd like to tell me, that's fine. Otherwise, next week I will also have a video for you. Thank you. Bye.